Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going from stamps to outdoor scenes using the new Storybook Illustrations collection from Spellbinders. This is the Wild Friends stamp set. Lots of adorable outdoor animals there. This is the Words for the Wild sentiment. Lots of different sentiments, as well as I love the different font and font combinations in there. This is the custom woodland stamp set, perfect for stamping backgrounds and creating backgrounds. This is the Can't Stand Still ladies, and this has a bunch of different stamps that you combine together to create the different ladies. And then lastly, we have the Into the Wild stamp set for creating scenes as well as backgrounds. So before I do any stamping, I'm going to take all of my stamp sets and I'm going to use a white eraser on the stamping surface. This just removes any possible manufacturing residue and helps the stamp take ink a little bit better. Now I'm choosing to watercolor my cards, so I'm going to be using watercolor cardstock here, and I'm going to stamp all of my images and watercolor them all at once before turning them into cards. So I'm starting with the Wild Friends stamp set. I will be stamping this with black StazOn. Typically when I'm doing watercolor, I like to heat emboss the stamps themselves. I like that raised edge and I like that shiny line. For the look that I'm going for these, they don't really work. It doesn't really work well with heat embossing. So I'm just going to use a permanent ink, and my choice of permanent ink is black StazOn. And StazOn is a solvent ink, so we don't want to leave that ink on our stamps. So I'm using some Ultra Clean to spray onto the stamps and clean them after each use. I want to make sure that we get that ink off of there. Now the ink will stain the stamp just a little bit, but as long as we clean them off, they're good to go. It's not going to ruin the stamp at all, but I just don't want to leave them on there and put them back in the package with the ink on there. Now I am using my Misti stamping tool to stamp these images because I want to be able to stamp them multiple times and make sure that I have nice crisp images. I'm starting with the Wild Friends stamp set, and I did the two bears. Those are going to be their own scene on one of the cards. Then I'm creating or stamping a bunch of different critters from the Wild Friends stamp set. These ones were going to be fussy cut once I'm done, and they're going to be added to the different scenes. If you didn't want to fussy cut, you could use a masking paper and stamp, and then you still would have to fussy cut to mask those images. I chose to do fussy cutting because it gives that extra little bit of dimension because of the cardstock on top of the background scene. So I'm going to stamp this multiple times until I get the depth of ink color that I want, and I'm going to set those aside to dry. The StazOn dries really quite quickly, so it doesn't take a long time for it to dry, but I want to make sure that it's fully dry before I start my watercoloring. Next, I'm using the custom woodland stamp, and I'm going to create a little bit of a scene, and I'm keeping my scenes pretty simple here, but you could go more complicated. You could fill up the entire background if you wanted the entire thing to be like a wooded scene or whatever. I'm keeping them fairly simple. I don't want my cards to be too cluttered. So I'm starting with the two trees. They look like pine trees, and I have them staggered. There is also a stamp in this set to create a little bit of a hill. So I want to put those stamps on, or the trees on that bit of a hill. Now I chose to stamp those trees first and then add the hill. And I want to stamp the trees again. I put the trees on with the hill. However, because I have the two clear stamps right beside each other, they kind of leave a little bit of a space because they don't butt up really, really well. And you can see that my top tree there, or the tree that I have on the top of my Misti, isn't really stamping properly once I have that hill on the bottom. So I ended up taking the hill off anyways and still stamping it. So really best to do the trees separate from the hill. Otherwise you're going to have that space. You can also see on the left-hand side of my cardstock that there's a little bit of space between the hill and the trunk of that tree. If you want to avoid that, do them separately so then you can butt them up right next to each other. Another option would be to take a skinny black pen once this is done being watercolored and just fill in those areas. I tend to not bother with it simply because once we have the whole scene together and we have our animals and sentiment, you don't really notice those tiny little details like the tree not going all the way down to the hill, as well as the fact that when I'm watercoloring it, I will be watercoloring it right to the base anyway, so it will look like it's complete. Now, once I have the trees and the hill done, I'm going to put there's a log that I wanted to put in the bottom right corner, and then added a couple tufts of grass. There's also a log on its side that you could add as well. Again, I tried not to get too complicated with it. For the next background, I'm using the Into the Wild stamp set. So this one has a bunch of pine trees. It also has, or evergreen trees, it also has a cabin. So I'm putting the cabin kind of in the middle to the right. I'm putting a large evergreen tree to the left and then a small cluster. I'm going to have another evergreen tree that I stamp on a separate piece of watercolor paper, and I'm going to fussy cut that and put that in front of the cabin. Now, rather than masking off my large tree there, when it comes to the small cluster of trees, I just realized that the bottom corner was going to cover the front of that tree, so I just didn't ink there. So that's another option too. For some simple shapes, it's really easy to just not ink a certain part of the stamp and make sure that you don't overlap those two images. So I opted to just do that with that because the tree itself, it doesn't matter if it's stamped perfectly. There's so many different options in the custom woodland and the Into the Wild stamp sets. So you can create many different looks or different types of backgrounds with them. I just love the variety in them and the different options you can do. Next, I'm going to be using the Can't Stand Still Ladies, and I'm just going to stamp one lady. I want to have like a wooded suggestion of a background and then have her walking in the foreground of that background. So I'm starting with her skirt, then I'm going to add some feet, and there's several different choices. Now there are different bottoms of the body, if you will, and then different tops. So you can pick and choose which ones you want. There's also different heads as well as some hands holding things. So you can customize the look however you want. So it gives you lots of options for creating, and I love the fact that there are those different options. Now, these are the Can't Stand Still Ladies. They are, most of the figures are walking, but there is one option for a bottom that is sitting. So again, you can customize it to the look that you want, and then there's shoes to match that sitting figure as well. So I am doing them basically from the bottom, or doing this figure basically from the bottom to the top, other than the fact that I did her bottom half of her body before doing the shoes. And I did it that way simply because I thought it would be easier to match up the shoes that way than to match up the legs with the shoes. Probably would work the same either way, but I opted to do it that way. Now there is a umbrella top here that I wanted to also stamp. I want to have her holding the umbrella. Now there is not an umbrella handle, so I'm going to be using a Posca pen once the image is done and just drawing in that umbrella handle. It's nice and straight. It doesn't need to be anything very complicated at all. So I'm going to create another background, this time using the bear trees. Now you could do the bear trees on their own. There are some leaves in the custom woodland stamp set if you wanted to add some greenery to those trees, but I thought it would be a nice fall look to have them kind of bare in the background. The other thing too is you can use, when you're watercoloring, you can use the watercolors to add some green to the trees as well. You can have some fun with that. So the tree that I have stamped to the right of my image there, I'm just going to stamp that once. The one to the left, I'm going to stamp that multiple times and fill it in. When I was creating this background scene, I thought I might like to do the one that I have on the right a couple times, but because it's a little bit larger, it's fairly distinct, I think it looks a little bit repetitive to have that same one. But again, there are different options in the different sets that you can mix and match. And I love the fact that there are different things that you can mix and match with each other. It makes it nice and easy and fun to fill in those backgrounds. So for watercoloring, I'm watercoloring with Distress Reinkers. These are to refill ink pads, specifically Distress ink pads, but I like to use them for watercoloring as well. I always love when supplies have more than one use to them. I'm going to start by watercoloring the backgrounds of my scenes. Then I'm going to start watercoloring the foreground areas. Much easier to do it that way. This way you can see I can go right on top of those trees. The green that I'm using for the trees is going to be darker than what I'm using for the sky. And as I'm working on the sky, you can see that I am not making the sky completely perfectly evenly blended. I have some areas that are darker, some areas that are lighter, and I'm doing that intentionally. I think it just gives the background a little bit more of an interesting look. These stamps were designed by Josh Griffiths, and if you look at his style, this is very similar to his style when he is watercoloring, and I just really like that look and wanted to kind of emulate it a little bit. So I'm using some Stormy Sky for my backgrounds. I start at the horizon and then work my way up, and then I go from the top down. So when you first watercolor with these inks, They are darkest when you first watercolor because you have the most ink on your brush, and then as there's less ink on the brush and more water, the color is more muted. This particular brush that I'm using has water right in the handle, so if I want to change colors, I have a piece of paper towel to my right that I will just squeeze the handle of the brush in, and it will flush the color right out of those bristles, and then I can change to whatever color I want to work with next. It's really, really handy. I don't have to have a jar of water on my desk. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if I had a jar of water on my desk, there would be a very good chance that I would spill it or drink it. And by doing this, I don't have to worry about either. And I also don't have another thing on my desk. It's really handy to use. I've been using this brush for years and I absolutely love it. Now I have a palette here with those distress reinkers in it. These reinkers just live, or I put a drop of them in there and it goes a really long way. And I have these stored horizontally on a shelf. You do not want to have those inks in this palette and then tilt it because they will all run out. The ink never dries on this palette. So it is the perfect thing for watercoloring for me. Right below each one of those wells, I have a little label that I've written the color of the ink that is in that well, and I've used that ink to color on top of it as well, so I know exactly which color tone is in each one. Some of the colors, especially the darker colors, they all look the same, so by doing it this way I can easily see exactly what color is in each well, and I can make sure that when I go to put a new color in it or refill it, that I'm using the correct color. And I prefer to do several different watercolors at once. Like in this instance, I prefer to do all of the skies and then all of the ground and then start to watercolor the different elements that are stamped on top. It just goes, in my opinion, a little bit more smoothly because I don't have to change the colors on my brush as much. So for the greenery, I'm using some forest moss. You can use whatever colors you really want, and you can also watercolor with whatever watercolors you like. You could also do these with watercolor pencils. You would have, or watercolor crayons, you would have a little bit more of a chalky look to them. I prefer the distress refills simply because they have a little bit more of a clear look to them and they don't really have that chalky look, and it's just my personal preference. So there's not really a right or wrong. You can see that I did the background here. Some areas are lighter, some areas are darker. I did it a bit darker at the base of the hill and where the grass kind of meets the hill. Again, I put certain areas lighter, certain areas darker, sometimes by chance and sometimes on purpose. I will do the cluster of greenery here right after doing the greens on my trees there so that they are a little bit darker than the ground or the grass below it. Next, I'm going to be doing the grass below our little bears here. Again, making it darker in some areas. You can see that I'm watercoloring really quite quickly. I'm not doing it slowly. I tend to do it fairly quickly. I want to make sure that the ink can kind of blend and bleed into each other as I'm working, and I don't want to get watermarks on there. But I will swap back and forth between the different images. This time I'm doing all of the ground, all of the grass, all of the greenery. Then I will switch to my next color. You could, if you prefer, do one image and background at a time and then let them dry while you're working with the other ones. I just find that by doing, say, all of the blue for the sky and then all of the green for the grass and trees, it just works a little bit more smoothly. I feel like I'm being a little bit more efficient with it. Once we have our background done, I can do that separate tree. Now, when I typically do watercolor, as I was saying before, I typically heat emboss the images so that when I'm doing the watercolor themselves, I can watercolor one color beside a completely different color, and the ridges from that heat embossing will help that ink stay where it's supposed to be. Because this was stamped with StazOn ink, not heat embossed, they don't have the ridges. So when I am watercoloring, I am aware of what might still be wet and what is dry and whether I want that to bleed or not. So here I'm doing the trees. My sky probably isn't 100% dry. It's mostly dry, but I might get a tiny little bit of bleeding from those trees. And for the look that I'm going for, I don't mind for this background, but for other pieces, I might not want that to bleed. So I will make sure that it is 100% dry before I go to that next area. It doesn't take a ton of time for it to dry because I'm not using a ton of water. If it was something where you could still see the sheen from the water on there, I would be a little bit more careful on it. And again, it just depends on the look that you're going for. So now I'm working with some vintage photo to do the trunks of the trees, to do that stump there. I'm also going to be using the same color to do those bears on their own background scene. And I'm using this same vintage photo for my cabin in the woods there. Anytime I put my brush into that well of color, that's when it's going to be the darkest. So I'm making sure to start my watercolor where I want my color to be darkest. So for this one here, for the cabin, I want the color to be darker towards the base of the cabin, lighter towards the top. At this point, I realized that I haven't actually colored the trees from this background, so I'm going to quickly fill those in. And again, you can see that I'm working fairly quickly. You could work slower if you want. I've done watercolor throughout the years, and I can't say that I'm like a professional watercolor, but I kind of know what I like to do, and I tend to just do it. I don't really overthink it. Now for these trees, I will make some areas lighter, some areas darker. So these are kind of almost little triangle shapes. So right below the branches above it, I will make that a bit darker. The edges of the branches will end up being a little bit lighter, so we're having some natural light and shadows in there. Again, I don't really overthink it too much because these are for cards. We're going to be adding a sentiment, and I'm also going to be adding those fussy cut animals in front of it. And in my opinion, those are going to be more of the focal point than the background scene. Once we have our cabin and the trees watercolored, I'm going to add a red roof to that cabin. So I'm going to use some aged mahogany, and again, being a little bit darker toward the edge of the roof, and then watercoloring it out and making the color a little bit lighter for the top and towards the back of the roof. I'm also going to use that aged mahogany for the trim on the windows. And if by chance you accidentally go into the wrong well, like I just did, I'm going to correct that and put the aged mahogany on top of, I think it was like dried marigold or something that I accidentally did and was wondering why the color was wrong. The aged mahogany goes right over top of that. I put a little bit of squeezed lemonade in the window to make it look like we've got some lights on in the window. And then I added a little bit of the forest moss to kind of make it look like there's some bushes around the edges of that cabinet. So I'll set that aside to dry and then grab the vintage photo once again to watercolor these adorable little bears. Now I am making the color a little bit darker towards the base of the bear, a little bit lighter towards the top. Obviously the color is running out and I can't do the entire image all at once. So I do start with some color, and then I kind of make sure that that whole bear is a little bit damp before going back in with the next colors. By making sure, or next amount of color, by making sure that it's a little bit damp when I'm doing my watercolor, they're going to start to blend and bleed naturally. It makes it a little bit easier for that watercolor, and then I can also ensure that I'm not getting like watermarks where that color is drying before I get the next amount of color on there. And you can keep watercoloring over and over if you want. You just want to make sure that you have that full area watercolor. So once again, with the little baby one, I went in and just made sure that whole baby was a little bit damp before going in with that color, taking some of the excess off my brush and then blending it out just a little bit. And I made the adult bear a little bit darker than the baby. And as I'm going back in, I'm just putting extra little bits of darkness in the areas where I think there would be some shadow so that it's just not one flat color. Once we have that done, we can set that aside to dry. I put a little bit of tattered rose on the inside of the ear so that we have a little bit of pink in there and a little tiny bit on the tips of the nose. Again, just for that little bit of pinkness there. And that will start to blend and bleed into that vintage photo as well. So I do that while it's all still wet. So now we have our adorable little separate critters to do. So I'm going to start with the deer, doing that in the vintage photo. And again, starting where I want the color to be darkest and then blending it out. If I need more color, I can dab it into those wet areas and it will start to blend and bleed with them. And as we're working, I kind of assume we have a sun in the sky, so the light is going to be coming from above. Any shadows would be on the underneath areas. So that's kind of where I pick and choose where to do the lights and the shading. And you can keep going back in and adding a little bit more color as you go. And if you accidentally get a little bit too much color, you can wipe your brush off and you can wipe some of that color off and take some of the color out. Obviously, you can't get the cardstock right back to white, but you can take a little bit of that excess color out. Once I get the image how I like it or I'm satisfied with it, then I will let them totally dry. So we're going in and doing the bunnies next, and I'm doing those with that vintage photo as well. So you can see, like right when I'm starting this bunny here, I can get a really, really pale shade with that. And when you compare it to the Deer, which is that same color palette, you can get some different shades, which is one of the reasons why I like using distress reinkers for watercoloring. You can add a ton of water and get a really pale shade of that color, or you can use very little water and get a really dark color. So you can get a lot of different shades in one color. Next, I used some Tattered Rose for our umbrella as well as Our Lady's face. I tried to keep the colors fairly muted. I think it would also be fun to use some bright colors, have her in bright colors on top of or in front of the wooded background. But again, I kept them fairly muted. I opted to start with some milled lavender for her dress, but after doing her dress, I thought it was a little bit too pale and too muted. So I ended up adding some seedless preserve so that we had a little bit more of a deeper color to it. I like the color for milled lavender, but for what I was going for, it was just a little bit too pale, a little bit too, just didn't have enough color to it to go against that background. Going over it with that seedless preserves definitely helps. It brightens that color. It also makes it so that it has a little bit more of a contrast to the background. So again, when it comes to her clothes, I'll make the color darker between the layers on the bottom of her skirt. Around the outside of her body, there would be some natural shading towards the bottom, because again, if we have the sun coming from the top, it would be lighter towards the top simply because there would be more light coming from it, and there would be shadows towards the bottom. And you can see that I didn't completely cover that milled lavender. I just added some of that seedless preserve so that we had a little bit more of a contrast. I used some hickory smoke for her shoes, and then I used some of the vintage photo for her hair. I'm going to also use that hickory smoke for our little raccoon as well as our hedgehog or porcupine. I'm not really sure what it's supposed to be. I'm not sure what it is, but I always have a hard time with drawn images of hedgehogs and porcupines. I can never tell what exactly they're supposed to be, but that image is absolutely adorable. So I just wanted to do it anyway. So I'm doing it in grays. In my mind, it's more of a hedgehog than a porcupine. So I did the grays. I'm doing the grays for the back or his back. And then I'm going to be doing some Tattered Rose for his stomach. For the raccoon, I did mostly hickory smoke. Again, making sure there's some areas that are lighter, some areas that are darker. And then I went in with a little bit of black soot to do the stripes on his tail as well as his little mask by his eyes. I just wanted that to be a little bit darker, a little bit more prominent. So with the hedgehog, again, I said I did the hickory smoke on his back. While that is still wet, I'm going to do the Tattered Rose on his stomach so that it will blend and bleed into that hickory smoke on his back. I also did that Tattered Rose on the nose as well as inside the ears for my little raccoon there. And then realized that I didn't do the back of the other ear properly. I had made it the Tattered Rose rather than the hickory smoke. So just added a little bit of extra detail there. So once we have all of our critters watercolored, they need to be fussy cut. I will let them dry completely and then fussy cut them right along the edge of that stamped image. Because the umbrella top was one of the first ones that I did on here, I started with that because it had already dried. And again, just going against the edges of that stamped image. When I'm doing my fussy cutting, my scissors in my right hand don't really move a whole lot. My left hand is guiding that stamped image or the line of the stamped image into the blade of my scissors. That tends to have the best results. So I did the rest of my fussy cutting off screen. For each one of my background images, I am trimming them down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. I'm not matting these on anything at all. I wanted to keep my images as big as possible, but I still wanted to have the mat of my white card base around it. I am going to stamp each one of these backgrounds with some Versamark ink and heat emboss my sentiments onto them with some black embossing powder. Now I made sure that my watercolor images were 100% dry before starting this. If they're not 100% dry, your embossing powder is going to stick to the damp cardstock, so you want to make sure that it's absolutely dry. Even with that, I still put a little bit of embossing powder tool on the area where I was stamping my sentiment before stamping it with that Versamark ink, pouring on the embossing powder, and then using my heat tool to melt it. Now, the Words for the Wild stamp set has a ton of different sentiments. I pick and chose my sentiments based on the space that I had on the card as well as what they said. So some of the sentiments would have been too big. I might have liked them, but they would have been too big, and I didn't want to go over the images themselves. Again, I kept them really, really simple. I didn't think that it needed a whole lot to them. And I chose to do all of my sentiments in black to coordinate with our lined images. You could also do them in other colors if you wanted. You could do, say, Vintage Photo Distress Glaze if you wanted to have a little bit more of a natural look to them. So here's my second image. As soon as you have the stamping and the watercoloring done, the rest of the card comes together really, really quickly. And of course the fussy cutting done. So again, I used a little bit of embossing powder tool. I chose a stamp that was going to fit in that area, stamped it with some Versamark ink, and then poured on the black embossing powder, tapped off the excess. If by chance you have any grains of embossing powder where you don't want them to go, just use a soft brush to brush it off before you use your heat tool to melt it. Then once it's heat embossed, I let it cool down a little bit, 5-10 seconds, then glued it to the background of the card. So this is one of the backgrounds where I wanted to add some of those fussy cut animals. So I added my little hedgehog as well as my deer here. And because we have these animals fussy cut, we have that extra little thickness from the cardstock that they were created with. So it gives it that extra little bit of natural dimension, which is why I chose to do it this way. If you wanted it all to be flat, like I said earlier, you could use some masking paper and mask those images off and create your scenes that way. For the look that I was going for, I opted not to do this. So for the next background, once again, I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, put it in my Misti stamping tool, aligned my sentiment stamp, used a little bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock before stamping it with that Versamark ink. And I stamped it a couple times to make sure that I had a nice full sentiment on there. Then poured on that embossing powder, again, rubbing off any excess that might get stuck where you don't want it. Once you have it how you want it, you can use that embossing tool to melt that powder down. I think these stamps would also be great for creating some mixed media, as well as like even some backgrounds for scrapbook pages. I think you could have a lot of fun with that as well. And these sentiments as well, I think would be great for on scrapbook pages, or just even some mixed media. There's so many different options for this that you can have a lot of fun with. This background here is where I'm going to add that fussy cut tree, and I'm gluing everything together with some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so I can put as much or as little as I need for each one of those little images. I love using liquid glue because it gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy your pieces in place, and so you have perfect placement with them. You don't have to get it right the first time. Once I have those images on there, I do put an acrylic block on there just to hold everything nice and flat while I am working on something else. I grabbed a white and a black Posca pen just to add some details to my little deer here. I wanted to fill in the dots on his little back with that white pen, and then I realized that I hadn't watercolored his hoofs. They weren't done evenly, so I just used the black one just to fill that in. I'm also using the black one on this cabin for right around the frame, just kind of making it a little bit more solid. I did watercolor it with that aged mahogany, but I just like the look of it with that black on there as well. It seemed to give the windows a little bit more of a finished look. This is our last background, and we're going to put our Can't Stand Still lady on there. So once again, trimming that down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. You could trim these down even more and add a mat around them, but I just didn't think it was necessary. So once I have it trimmed, I put it in my Misti stamping tool, a little bit of embossing powder tool on my background. Then I am stamping that sentiment with some Versamark ink and using that black embossing powder. I did my sentiments for all 4 cards exactly the same so that they would have some continuity to them, and I just really thought the black sentiments looked really nice on those backgrounds and suited the look of those cards. So this one has the Livin' the Dream, and I just thought it would be fun to have her walking with that umbrella, just because even though it's raining doesn't mean you're not living the dream. So again, gluing this to our A2 card base with that liquid glue, making sure that we get it all around those edges so that it's going to stick nicely. Now, when you're watercoloring, often the watercolor cardstock will start to warp. So that is another reason, especially when I'm doing watercolor, that I will use that acrylic block. I want to make sure that it lays everything down nice and flat so that glue has some good contact with that card base. Then we're going to add our stamped and watercolored lady as well as her umbrella on top of there. Now again, you could do even brighter colors than this. I wanted the colors to be a little bit more earthy toned, so I opted to go with this particular color tone. I wanted her to show up off that background, but I didn't want her to be too bright. Once I have that umbrella in place, I just used a ruler with that black Posca marker to give that umbrella a handle. And there is the final result. Now, when I am watercoloring, I will often add stickles or glossy accents to add some sparkle or some shine. I opted not to do that on these ones because of the outdoor feel to them. I just didn't think there was any areas that they would look nice or it would suit the images. But if you wanted to add a little bit of texture to them, those are great mediums for adding texture to your backgrounds or to your watercolored images. You'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. I absolutely love the look of these outdoor cards and just the feel and vibe of these stamps in general. I think they just have a fabulous look to them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.